Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Did you get enough Halloween candy this year? Did you run out before running out of trick or treaters? Well, there's always next year. But you don't want to run out of coffee. So swing by the Organic Man Coffee Trike at 4501 McPherson and stock up. The best coffee on the planet can be yours for just a few of your hard earned bucks. If it's too far to drive, you can go to organicmancoffeetrike.shop. Ryan Dionker, living down below in Australia, sent me an idea for a show. It involves the mystery surrounding Lake Griffon. It's the granddaddy of Great Lakes folklore, like the Titanic for Michiganers, which is his home state. The ship was one of the first proper sailing ships to sail the lakes, intended to be a game changer for commercial trade. The story of the men who built it was one of those great, weird stories about the will and the spirit of men who sometimes didn't really think things through. To add to the problem, it sank on its maiden voyage, and it is still a mystery as to where it sets on the bottom of the lakes, or even which of the Great Lakes it is in. Ryan says he was obsessed with the story when he was younger. He had found an old piece of timber in a place called Griffon Bay while they were on a family vacation. His dad told him it was from the shipwreck. Well, Ryan kept the piece of wood and he read every book that he could find about that particular ship. The wreck, and he did school reports so often that his teachers began to say that maybe he should talk about something else. Ryan says that he knows his dad was actually just telling a story, but it was so that his mind would focus on something that would give him a quest of sorts. The bay was named for a portage site. It's a low water crossing where Indians would carry or portage their canoe. His dad wouldn't let the truth spoil something that might inspire his son's curiosity. She keeps moving the microphone. Anyhow, too many people think it's a good idea to crush kids' magical fantasies. A Santa Claus? Don't be ridiculous. They remove all forms of fantasy from their kids so that they'll grow up and become members of the Skeptical Inquirer and try to debunk everything unknown. Without mysteries and magic, the world is just too mundane. The boys in the white lab coats hate life. They hate their lives and they hate our lives. They probably hate you as well. Anything that can't be recreated in a laboratory is not real. Let's see them create gravity. The Great Lakes make up 85% of all the fresh water in North America. The Indians living around the edges had some interesting stories about what just might lurk under the waves. The Ojibwe Indians believed there was a huge underwater panther called Mishipishu. It had the head and the paws of an enormous cat. It had horns like a bison, the scaly body of a snake, and it had a spiky tail. It made a roaring sound whenever it was on the surface of the water. The Seneca spoke of Gasayandiatha, an enormous snake that breathed fire like a dragon, and it could fly. The Wendigo is an Algonquin monster that's feared by everybody in the area. Oh, everybody that believes in mysteries like I do. This terrifying creature was known to roam about during the winter months and was thought to be responsible for the manifestation of some of the darker parts of the human nature. In winter, famine, gluttony, and cannibalism were all combined into this one creature. Living on the banks of such large lakes, the locals considered them to be the homes of some bizarre creatures. Why would so many folks all come up with these things unless there was some truth behind their legends? What nobody is expecting was for diseases to be spread amongst both sides. Sorry, I jumped ahead there. When Europeans began exploring the lands away from the East Coast, they had to rely on the Indians to find out what might lie below the next horizon, beyond the next horizon. The first people to encounter Indians thought that they were the lost tribes of Israel. Most of the encounters were to the mutual benefit of both sides. What nobody was expecting was for the diseases to be spread amongst both sides, causing hostilities to crop up. This was soon followed by people with other than nice ideas, people with their own agendas in mind to take advantage of the locals. I have to say it. 1492, the Indians discovered a huge problem with their immigration policy. Thinking there was something better to be had by moving west, the explorers began looking for ways to travel without all that walking. The first recorded contact between Europeans and the Great Lakes Indians occurred around 1534 to 1542. Jacques Cartier of France explored the St. Lawrence River. The first European to see the Great Lakes is believed to be Etienne Brulé, a French explorer who lived among the Huron Indians in the early 17th century. A lot of explorers were actually looking for gold. Now, there were a few that were looking at the vast areas of land with very few inhabitants as a possible new place to live. All the land in Europe was owned by the royals. You were allowed to live and work the land, but everything belonged to those people. Columbus stabbed the ground with his flagpole and declared the land belonged to the King of Spain. But there was no way of maintaining this enormous land grab. France, Portugal, England, every royal family was trying to stake their claim to this vast, untamed wilderness. Never mind all those people that already lived there. Most Indians living in the Great Lakes region for the last 5 centuries are of the Algonquin family. This includes present day tribes such as the Menominee, Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Oneida, who live near Green Bay, belong to the Iroquois, and the Ho Chunks, they're one of the few Great Lake tribes to speak Siouan language. Great Lakes Indians are called woodland tribes since they lived in heavily wooded areas, as opposed to the Plains Indians. Woodland Indian society depended to a large degree on forest products for their survival. The Great Lakes Indians hunted, fished, gathered wild food, and practiced agriculture for their subsistence. In many parts of the Great Lakes, particularly in and around Wisconsin, Indians grew wild rice as a dietary staple, while Indians in areas without wild rice usually cultivated corn. There were sugar maples growing in the area, and a few of the Indian tribes made sugar as part of their diet and as a trade good. French explorer Jacques Cartier, in his 3 voyages into the Gulf of St. Lawrence in 1530 and 1540, conducted some of the earliest fur trading. between Europeans and the First Nations people sometime in the 16th century. Later, he explored other parts of the area. Cartier attempted limited fur trade with the First Nations in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and along the river. He concentrated on trading for fur that was used for trim and accessories, adornments to rich people's clothing. He didn't much care for the beaver fur. He thought that it was not that good looking and probably useless. Over the years, fur trade is a driving force that created many of the states up around the Great Lakes. It became quite fashionable in Europe. As trappers began to venture further and further west, they found some good hunting locations on the west side of the Great Lakes. Having to walk all that way took forever. Small boats could be used on the lakes, but they had a bad tendency of suddenly becoming violent, causing a lot of these explorers and trappers to vanish. It was impossible to sail up the St. Lawrence River beyond Niagara Falls. Beaver pelts were used to make those weird hats that folks thought were all the rage. The Indians would kill a beaver and they'd skin it. They'd eat all the parts that weren't made out of bone or fur, and they used the skin to make clothing. They used the bones for other things as well. As people in Europe discovered beaver was far better for clothing than most of the things they thought they were using, the demand for dead river rodents increased. The transition from a seasonal coastal trade into a permanent interior fur trade was marked with the foundation of Quebec on the St. Lawrence River in 1608. Samuel Samuel de Champlain officially established the settlement in New France. I'm getting my Spanish and my French pronunciations mixed, which I don't really speak either language that well. During the early 1500s, European ships and fishing crews off the coast of northern Canada often traded with the Indians. The first recorded contact between Europeans and Great Lake Indians occurred 1534 when Jacques Cartier of France explored the St. Lawrence River. His failure to find gold or silver reduced French interest in North America. But despite this, Samuel de Champlain established the city of Quebec along with the colony of New France in 1608. The French quickly developed a military and economic alliance with the neighboring Algonquin tribes and the Iroquois Indians near Lake Huron. Well, soon the Dutch of New Netherlands established a rival colony in present day New York. They developed similar trade networks with the five Iroquois nations in upstate New York. Here's a little something for a rainy day. The Dutch bought Manhattan Island from the Indians. However, the tribe they were doing business with weren't from that area. The legend says that the fully legalized this statement, the Dutch colonial governor of New Amsterdam, Peter Minute, offered the natives trinkets and glass beads that were worth about $24 in exchange for ownership of the land. The chief who accepted the payment walked away, heading back home. He didn't actually have any say as to who owned that particular piece of land. He was more than happy to take the goods, seeing as his tribe didn't live on the island, they lived on the mainland. He was actually selling someone else's territory. 1534, Cartier was commissioned by King Francis I of France to explore the northern American lands in search of riches and looking for the Northwest Passage. This would lead to Asia. Old Chris had been convinced that he had found India, not the Americas. Until his dying day, Chris thought he had sailed to islands off the coast of India. Trade with India, a dot not feather, was very lucrative. Anyone finding a shorter way of getting there was going to become very wealthy very fast. Cartier entered the Gulf of St. Lawrence by the Strait of Belle Island, explored its barren north coast for a distance, and then traveled down the west shore of Newfoundland to Cape Anguilla. From there, he sailed around Magdalen and Prince Edward Islands, exploring Chaleur Bay and claiming Quebec Gasp Peninsula for France. He discovered the inlet of the St. Lawrence River, sailed north to Anticosti Island, and then he returned to Europe. Previously thought to be a barren and inhospitable region, Cartier's discovery of the warm, fertile lands around the Gulf of St. Lawrence inspired Francis I to dispatch him on a second exploration in 1535. On this voyage, he ascended the St. Lawrence to the native village of Hochelaga, the site of the modern day city of Montreal. On his return voyage to France, he explored Cabot Strait along the southern coast of Newfoundland. Cartier led a final expedition to the region in 1541 as a part of an unsuccessful colonization effort. His extensive geographical discoveries formed the basis of France's claim to the St. Lawrence Valley in the 17th century. The folks coming over from Europe, they thought they knew everything. They were experts at farming and building. So they arrived in the Americas. Well, they didn't know how to grow food on this side of the Atlantic. That's why so many of them starved to death. What they should have done was gotten with the locals, which some of them did, and find out what kind of crops they could grow, where they could hunt, learn from the people that knew what they were doing, but they were all experts, and you can't tell an expert anything. In 1640s, the Iroquois began a series of wars in the Great Lakes region, mainly motivated by the fur-bearing lands of other Indian groups, completely wiping out some tribes, including the Erie, and scattering others, such as the Hurons, from their original homeland. The war between the Iroquois League and the French allied tribes persisted until 1701, although there were long periods of relative peace during this time. A lot of people picture the Indians only attacking the settlers. Well, actually, there were some Indians that wiped out other Indians. There was not peace and a bunch of tree hugging folks running around the Americas. There were some hostile folks. There were some folks that liked to eat other people. Later, when English conquered New Netherlands in 1664 and renamed it New York, the Iroquois transferred their loyalties to the English. Wouldn't that be something, instead of calling it New York City, if we called it New Netherland City? Just a thought. The wars radically changed the human landscape of the Great Lakes region. The tribes in Michigan's southern peninsula, the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, the Sioux, the Fox, and the Ottawa, were pushed farther west into Wisconsin during the 1600s. Some tribes that moved into Wisconsin because of the Iroquois Wars included the Huron, the Miami, the Sioux, the Fox, the Muscotine, and the Kickapoo. They left Wisconsin during the 1700s for new lands west of the Mississippi or other parts of the Midwest. Some of these folks of the Iroquois Wars, namely the Potawatomi and the Ojibwe, stayed in Wisconsin. Indians of the Great Lakes also suffered from European diseases, which often devastated their communities. Indians did not have a natural immunity to diseases such as smallpox, measles, or mumps, because these diseases didn't exist in North America before us white devils arrived. After Europeans arrived, these diseases often wiped out whole Indian villages. The Ho Chunk, for example, were said to have between 4 and 5,000 people when Nicolette first arrived among them in 1634. When French traders came back about 20 years later, the Ho Chunk had been reduced to 600 or 700 people. The folks coming from Europe had been living with so many diseases for so long, they had developed all kinds of immunities. This is the only reason they were still alive. Survival of the nastiest. The Indians managed to stay away from most diseases, so when one did come calling at their front door, they had no defenses against it. Some of the first Europeans to come to the Great Lakes region were Christian missionaries. One of the most active groups was the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits, a Roman Catholic religious order that first started to preach among the Iroquois speaking Hurons of the Lake Huron in 1625. By 1665, they had established missions in Chickamauga Bay, in Lake Superior, and at Green Bay. While the Jesuits enjoyed some success, they required such rigid standards for potential converts, and they didn't convert large numbers of Indians to Christianity. At least they didn't beat themselves with chains. At least I don't think they did. Whatever progress they made was lost in 1728 when they had to abandon their mission stations in Wisconsin because of the Fox Wars, during which the Fox Indians rose up against the French authority. The Fox Wars ended in 1730, but the French were unable to send new missionaries to Wisconsin afterwards. The next Christian missionaries that arrived were represented by both Catholic and Protestant groups. Many young English, Scottish, and French men that went west in the 1700s looking for furs or new lands uh, wound up marrying some of the Indian women. Now, there weren't any European women along, and you spend time with the local tribe, eventually you're going to take on some of their mannerisms, some of their ways, and eventually you're going to meet your new wife. Unlike Europeans, Indians didn't use race as a basis for exclusion or inclusion into their tribes. The children of these marriages were welcomed as tribal members. They weren't called half breeds by the Indians, they were just Indians. These intermarriages are one of the reasons that so many Indians in Wisconsin and the Great Lakes have European, especially French, last names. Not all the children of Indian white marriages joined their mothers' tribes. Some Indian women raised their children in fur trading towns like Green Bay, uh, Prairie du Chien, uh, Mackinac Island, places like that. While these children were of Indian heritage and usually knew the language and the customs of their mother's tribes, they didn't consider themselves to be Indians. They thought of themselves as métis, which was a French word meaning mixed blood. They were métis communities throughout the Great Lakes region during the 17 and the 1800s. In the 1600s, explorers and trappers had become familiar with the St. Lawrence River. They knew they could sail from the Atlantic Ocean until they encountered the falls. This was an unmanageable barrier that had to be bypassed by means of walking. They knew the Great Lakes were just a few miles farther to the south, but there was no way of dragging a ship up onto the land, pulling it through the tree strewn area, and launching it into the Lake Erie. This meant that all the furs being brought to the town had to be hauled by horseback until reaching Lake Ontario. November 18th, 1678, after a month of preparation at Fort Frontenac, La Salle dispatched Captain Lamotte and Father Louis Hennepin, along with 15 men, to locate a site where a sailing vessel was to be constructed on the upper side of the falls. They sailed west until their ship became frozen in place. The men had to chop ice so they could get to the shore with all of their supplies. Now I have to ask, why did they set out in November? Anybody with half a brain would say, let's see, it's November now. That means December, January, February. It's going to snow. It's going to freeze. Hey, let's go live in the woods. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? They did what Napoleon did and what Hitler did when they invaded Russia. They just didn't think what's going to happen next month. Once the ice had thinned out a bit, the crew was able to sail to the mouth of the Niagara River. They arrived on December 6th, Pearl Harbor Day, which wouldn't happen for another 264 years. They went as far south as they could until they were forced to stop due to the flow of the river being stronger than their ability to sail, as well as massive ice flows that were making progress impossible. Now came the fun part. Everything had to be carried south until they could find a decent location to build a ship. There had to be enough trees to build with, as well as a shallow enough bank so the ship could be pulled by hand into the water. Once a location was found, the men had to build housing and fortifications because any shipbuilding could take place. The local Indians weren't too keen on having these Frenchmen on their land. It was one thing to have traders come by, exchange some goods, and then leave. These guys wanted to build things that might lead to a village forming. Once a suitable location was found, Hennepin and Lamotte began a 75-mile trek in knee-deep snow on a diplomatic mission to the Seneca tribe so they could ask permission to continue building their little village along with a huge canoe. Beginning on Christmas Day, 1678, Lamotte and Hennepin and four of their men went with snowshoes to a prominent Seneca chief who resided in Tagarondis, a village east of Niagara. I almost said Nicaragua. That would have been a misturn. Niagara. Negotiations with the Seneca were only moderately successful. As Lamotte and his five companions left the village, they weren't too sure that the Indians would allow the camp or the shipbuilding to continue. Meanwhile, La Salle and Henry de Tonty had departed Fort Frontenac in a second vessel some days after Lamotte and Hennepin. La Salle followed the southern shore of the lake. Once they had found a suitable spot to anchor, La Salle decided to visit the Seneca at Targarandus himself. He put ashore near the present day Rochester, New York, and he arrived at the village shortly after Lamotte and Hennepin had left. He was more successful in securing the Indians' tolerance of his proposed big canoe and supporting big buildings. With La Salle back aboard their vessel, the company again sailed west until about 25 miles from Niagara. On the ocean, a ship is steered by a helmsman. In the lakes, they're steered by a pilot. I don't know what the difference is. It's kind of the same way that on the ocean you have a ship, but on the lakes you have a boat. It doesn't matter how big it is, it's still called a boat. The Edmund Fitzgerald was a boat, not a ship. It's one of those nautical things that I don't understand. When La Salle left, he had secured much better agreement between himself and the chief. The site that La Salle had selected had conclusively been identified as being near the mouth of Cayuga Creek, near Cayuga Island. After La Salle left on foot, the pilot and the rest of the crew were to follow with the supply vessel. On January 8th, the pilot and the crew decided they were going to spend the night on shore, where they were able to build a fire and sleep in some comfort. Those old sailing ships were designed to haul cargo, not people. When it was time to bed down, you laid on the floor, wherever you happened to wind up. Everything was damp, and it was near impossible to heat the ship since any open flame would probably destroy the vessel instead. It was a calm night, and the crew believed that the vessel was securely moored and it would ride out the night. A strong wind suddenly arose, causing the ship to drag its anchor along the bottom. The vessel was moved about 9 miles to the east before grounding and breaking up near present day 30-Mile Point. When La Salle heard of the loss, he left Niagara to go back and try to salvage what he could. They recovered the anchors, the chains, and most of the material critical for Le Griffon, but most of the supplies and provisions were lost. They had to drag all the material to the mouth of Niagara, where they rested for a few days in an Indian village. Then they had to carry all the materials through the snow and through the woods to the settlement above the falls where the ship was to be built. I'm still wondering why they started in winter, knowing that it was going to snow and freeze and get nasty. What was the big rush? A few months' wait would have made their mission so much easier. Well, the keel was laid January 26, 1679. A rough blueprint was used to build the ship, but the crew were not shipbuilders, they were sailors. La Salle left the building of Le Griffon under Tonty's care, and he set out on foot to return to Fort Frontenac. While frozen rivers did make traveling a bit easier, finding food was not. He arrived there nearly starved, only to find that his detractors had succeeded in stirring up doubt and opposition to his creditors. A people had invested money with La Salle, believing they would more than double their money in the first few months after Le Griffon was completed. Other merchants had been convinced these investors had wasted their cash. Addressing his problems delayed his return to the expedition for weeks. Meanwhile, Tonty refloated the ship that had been sunk and attempted to use it for more salvage work. Winter weather prevented success. He then charged Lamotte with salvage using canoes. One way of proceeding was to dangle ropes from the canoes with hooks on them and hope for the best. Another was to get someone to dive down to the bottom of the freezing water and look for salvageables. This is possible, but you need divers who can handle the extreme cold water. The Griffon was taking its time becoming a ship. The trees they cut down were too green to work with. Their tools were not up to the job. This compiled with the fact that the crew were not builders, they were sailors. Working in the snow with icy wind blowing from the north was playing havoc on the men. Food was running scarce, and there was no idea how long La Salle would take before he got back with the food. The workers had not been offered a salary. They were working on the promise of money to come once the ship was sailing about the Great Lakes, making an income. As their supplies dwindled and the work looked like it would never end, the men began to consider a mutiny. In the spring of 1679, as soon as the ice began to break up along the shores of Lake Erie, La Salle sent men from Forts Frontenac, Fanatic, Fort Frontenac in 15 canoes laden with supplies and merchandise to trade with the Illinois for furs at the trading posts of the upper Huron and Michigan lakes. These men were to compile furs and wait for Lake Griffon to come along and load them up. The uneasy truce with the Indians was tested by threats and attempts of sabotage and murder. A female Indian, who was closer to the Europeans than to her tribe, dropped a few words saying that the locals were planning to attack and destroy the ship before it could be launched. Tonty made a show of finishing in a few months, only to launch ahead of schedule, and Lake Griffon entered the waters early May 1679. Other merchants making profits from the fur trade had approached the workers with offers of money if they would keep the Griffon from ever setting sail. Somehow their efforts were never enough to stop the launch. A party from the Iroquois tribe who witnessed the launch were so impressed by the large floating fort that they named the French builders Haut Can, meaning penetrating minds, which corresponds with the Seneca word Haut Ga, which meant supernatural beings of the spirits. The tumultuous sound of Le Griffon's cannon amazed the Indians so much that the Frenchmen were able to sleep at night for the first time in months. After the Griffon was launched, she was rigged with sails and provisioned with 7 cannon. The French flag flew above the cabin, placed on top of the main deck that was elevated above the hull. People picture a huge, square sailed ship when thinking of the Griffon. It was nothing like in the movies. The Griffon was about a 45-ton vessel. It probably had a single mast with a couple of square sails and one triangular sail. It was about 30 to 40 feet long, about 10 to 15 feet at the beam or the width. I doubt the ship had a figurehead as seen in most carvings. There weren't any artists among the workers who could have made such a piece. But people say it had a griffin as the figurehead. July 1679, La Salle directed 12 men to tow Le Griffon through the rapids of the Niagara River with long lines stretched from the bank. They moored in quiet water off Squaw Island, 3 miles from Lake Erie, waiting for a favorable wind to blow. La Salle sent Tonty ahead in July 22nd with a few men, canoes, and trading goods to secure fur and supplies. The Griffon set off August 7th with a 34-man crew. They were navigating Le, Le Griffon. Oh man, my cat is hollering in the background, and I keep listening to her instead of what I'm saying. They were navigating Le Griffon through uncharted waters with only canoes had previously explored. They made their way around Long Point, Ontario, guided only by La Salle's memory of crude 10-year-old charts that he had looked at a long time before he got there. Let's just add a bit to the thrilling first voyage. Seeing as the favorable wind began in the early morning, they set sail in the dark. surrounded by fog, with only the sound of the waves hitting against rocks around them. Now, people didn't have flashlights back then. You could use a torch, but if you're hanging a torch off the side of a ship, you run the risk of accidentally setting the place on fire. All those sails, well, they were treated with waterproof material that made them highly flammable. So you couldn't use a torch, you just had to stare into the dark and hope you could see what was out there. Uh, Such adventures these men had. They sailed across the open water of Lake Erie. The shoreline in all directions was a solid wall of trees. No sign of any form of civilization. No friendly campfires or landing spots. The only food they had was what they had brought on board. This was the same thing they'd been eating all winter. They reached the mouth of the Detroit River August 10th, where they were greeted by three columns of smoke signaling the location of Tonty's camp. They anchored as close to shore as they thought was advisable, and Tonty and his men joined them. They sailed into a large body of water on August 12th, which is the feast day of St. Clare of Assisi, the name given to the lake after her. It is now known as Lake St. Clare. They sounded their way through the narrow channel of the St. Clare River. Uh, this is done by having a man standing out on the striker who would throw a weighted line out in front of the bow. As the ship moved forward to where the weight was settled, it was hauled back up. Knots in the line would show how many feet of water there were under the hull. This is not the job handed out to a guy who would mess up. The man doing the sounding had to be somebody that knew how the ship was built, how much of a draft it had, that's how many feet into the water it set. He also had to be thinking about what he was doing, not sitting there daydreaming about what he was going to do once he got back to Europe. When the crew encountered rapids, they used dozens of men and rope to tow the Griffon through the St. Clair River into the lower Lake Huron. They made their way north and west to Saginaw Bay on Lake Huron, where they were becalmed until noon of August 25th. Sailing ships could only move when the wind was blowing. To be calmed was to hit a spot with no wind. La Salle took personal command at this point, thinking that the pilot was not that good. He considered him somewhat negligent. What they needed was a Roman trireme. Those things had sails and rows, but then you needed a bunch of slaves to pull the oars. By noon, they started northwest with a northerly wind. The wind suddenly veered southeast. They changed course to avoid Presque Island. The ferocity of the gale forced them to retreat windward and lie to until morning. That's to sit on the downwind side of an island. By August 26th, the violence of the gale caused them to haul down their topmasts and lash the yards, that's the cross beams, to the deck, and to drift at the mercy of the storm. Even with no sails up, the ship would still be pushed around by the wind because it had these great big sides and that the wind would blow against it, moving the ship even if you were trying to steer it somewhere else. The waves became so high and the lake became so rough that La Salle had the crew looking for some safe harbor to wait out the storm. This is quite a trick, seeing as they could hardly see due to the driving wind and the spray from the waves. Father Hennepin wrote that during the fearful crisis of the storm, La Salle vowed that if God would deliver them, the first chapel erected in Louisiana would be dedicated to the memory of Saint Anthony of Padua, the patron saint of sailors. Louisiana was not just a state, it was the entire continent that was not under the control of the British or the Dutch. The wind slightly decreased, but they drifted slowly at night, unable to find a place to anchor. They were driven northwesterly until the evening of August 27th, when, under a light southerly breeze, they finally rounded Bois Blanc Island and they anchored in the calm water of a natural harbor of East Moon Bay. This is off Mission St. Ignace, where there was a settlement of Huron and Ottawa and a few Frenchmen. More than 100 Indians rowed out to gather around the Griffon and look at this big wooden canoe. La Salle, dressed in a scarlet cloak, bordered with lace and high plumed cap, like I said, those Europeans, they really like to dress up, had mass with his crew in a chapel of the Ottawas, and then made a visit with the chiefs. La Salle found that the 15 men that he had sent ahead from Fort Frontenac to trade with the Illinois had listened to his enemies, and they didn't think that the Griffon would ever show up. In other words, they had deserted. La Salle seized two of these deserters and sent Tonty with 6 men to go and try and arrest the other deserters. The short open water season of the upper Great Lakes compelled La Salle to depart from Green Bay on September 12th, 5 days before Tonty had returned. They sailed from the Straits of Mackinac to Washington Island, located at the entrance to Green Bay. They anchored on the south shore of the island, and they found it occupied by the Potawatomi, who was a friendly tribe. They also found some fur traders that La Salle had sent ahead, the ones that were still in his employ. The traders had collected 12,000 pounds of fur in anticipation of the arrival of the ship. 12,000 pounds of fur, that's a lot of dead rodents. La Salle gave instructions for the Griffon to offload merchandise for him at Mackinac that would be picked up on the return trip. He stayed behind with 4 canoes to explore the head of Lake Michigan. The Griffon rode out a violent storm for 4 days, and then on September 18th, the pilot and 5 crewmen sailing under a favorable wind headed for Niagara River. She carried a cargo of furs valued from 50 to 60,000 francs, or about $10,000 to $12,000. They had all the rigging and the anchors that were going to be used for a second vessel that La Salle intended to build now that the Griffon was making money. That was the last time the Griffon was ever seen. Father Hennepin wrote in his account of its accepted by most people. He said they sailed September 18th with a westerly wind. They fired a cannon, showing that they were on their way. Though the wind was favorable, it was never known what course they steered, nor how they perished. The ship was hardly a league from the coast when it was tossed up by a violent storm in such a manner that their men were never heard of since, and it is supposed that the ship sunk upon a sandbar and was buried. Now, this was all just speculation on his part. He didn't actually see this happen because the ship was too far from his location, but he was guessing. La Salle's account was similar as the father's. He wrote a letter to Abbe Bernous saying the bark, that was the kind of ship they had built, having anchored at the north of the Lac des Illinois, the pilot, against the opinion of some of the savages, that would be the Indians, who assured him that there was a great storm in the middle of the lake, but he wanted to continue his voyage without considering that the sheltered location where he was prevented him from knowing the real strength of the wind. They used to write weird back then. He was barely a quarter of a league from the shore when the savages saw the bark tossed in a manner so extraordinary, unable to resist the storm even though all the sails were lowered. A short time later they lost her from sight. They believed that she had perished against the shoals that were near the islands of the Hurons, where she was buried. I was going to say Abby Normal, but some of y'all wouldn't get it. So it's Abby Bernouse. The Potawatomi told La Salle 2 days after his departure from the island, the wind began to pick up. They told the pilot there was a storm out in the lake and it was a bad idea to sail. The pilot, who figured he was far more intelligent than these locals, set sail anyway, thinking his ship could weather the storm. As the ship moved away from the inlet, the wind caught it, and the crew scrambled to try to lower the sails. The wind was still having its way with the Griffon, and it was crashed against a sandbar. It sank within sight of the shore. Now, this is a third story that at least these people actually saw the ship sink. La Salle wrote in a second later, a few months on. He said that a young Indian boy who was his indentured servant, that's a servant that doesn't get paid. You could also call him a slave. This indentured servant encountered the pilot and four of the crewmen in a village to the south of Green Bay. The men were heading down to the Mississippi en route to an enemy tribe's village. La Salle believed that these men had stolen some, if not all, of the cargo and then sunk the Griffon. He figured these men were going to join the British. A Jesuit monk living in the area had his own idea as to what happened to the ship. He said the Indians had tricked the crew of the Griffon into allowing them on board just before it was time to sail. These Indians killed the crew and stole the cargo and then set the ship on fire. The monk was never anywhere near where the Griffon sank. He didn't know any of the tribe living there, and he wrote his report months after the event had taken place. In another letter written by La Salle to the governor of New France in 1683, he expressed his belief that the Griffon had been destroyed not by Indians, but by the pilot, who had been induced to sink her, and then, with some of the crew, attempted to join competing merchants with their plunder. Their plans went awry when they were captured by Indians who had a taste for human flesh. The Griffon is considered to be the first ship lost on the Great Lakes, as well as the first ship to sail it. It is considered to be the holy grail of Great Lakes shipwreck hunters. A number of sunken sailing ships have been suggested to be the Griffon, but except for the ones proven to be other ships, there has been no positive identification. 22 claims of finding the Griffon since 1800s, all but two have been definitively dismissed. One candidate was a wreck on the western end of Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron. In 1876, a lighthouse was constructed near the southwest end of Manitoulin Island. A shipwreck was found on the adjacent shore. In 1887, four skeletons were discovered in a depression behind a boulder, and two more in another nearby limestone cave. They were wrapped in birch bark and identified as being natives at the time. There were six crewmen on board the Griffon when it was last seen. This could be just mere coincidence, or these could have been the remains of the Griffon crewmen. The skeletons and most of the artifacts collected from the two caves and the wreck were stored at the lighthouse over the years, but they slowly disappeared. Either people hauled them away, they were sold, or they simply fell apart. You might be thinking why the wreck isn't sitting at the bottom where it was last seen. During a storm, bits and pieces of the wreck can be scattered all over the place. The parts that float might drift forever until washing up on some beach. The heavier parts would sink, but not necessarily in a straight line. To add to the confusion, it is estimated there are between 6 and 25,000 shipwrecks in this area. There's really no way of knowing for sure which parts belong to which ships. There could have been two ships go down close enough together to cause the Griffon to be claimed as a different wreck. In 1974, a book was published by Canadian newspaper reporter Harrison John McLean called The Fate of the Griffon. McLean said a Canadian commercial fisherman on the Bruce Peninsula on Lake Huron had found the wreckage of the Griffon, and that the fisherman's family had known about the wreckage for 120 years. McLean spent 19 years researching La Salle's voyage and the Griffon before the book was published. Subsequent independent researchers of the wreck in the 1980s determined that what he had actually found was a Mackinaw boat used in the fur trade in the 1850s. In 2001, near Poverty Point, adjacent to Green Bay on Lake Michigan, a 10.5-foot pole was found sticking up out of the lake bed. A private marine company, the Great Lakes Exploration Group, became tied up in years of legal squabbling with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. Finally, in June 16, 2013, permit in hand, an underwater pit was dug, allowing U.S. and French archaeologists to examine the object for the first time. They discovered a 15-inch slab of blackened wood that might have been man-made cultural artifact. June 19th, teams of archaeologists determined the wooden pole was actually 19 feet long, but there was no evidence that it belonged to a ship. Archaeologists became divided as to what this hunk of wood was. Some said it was the bowsprit, dating from hundreds of years ago. Others said, no, it's just a piece of wood used by modern day fishermen to secure a net. During excavation of the pole, another nearby area was searched. The sonar showed an object approximately 40 feet by 18 feet, similar to the dimensions of the Griffon, located under several feet of sediment. Excavation found nothing. Now you might be wondering which of the Great Lakes claimed the Griffon, Lake Michigan or Lake Huron? The ship was last seen in the area where the two lakes come together. If the Griffon was able to sail east, it would have been in Lake Huron. If the storm had pushed it west, it would have been in Lake Michigan. The letters written telling about the sinking were somewhat vague on the exact location. The names of the islands have also changed as different countries have taken possession of the area. December 27th, 2014, two divers, Kevin Dykstra and Frederick Monroe, announced the discovery of a wreck that they believed was the Griffon, based on a bow stem, which to some resembled an ornamental griffin. Their claim was quickly debunked when Michigan authorities drove down in June 2015 after receiving the coordinates. I'm sorry, they dove down, not drove. They dove down after receiving the coordinates. A Michigan State maritime archaeologist, Wayne Lasardi, presented evidence that the wreck was in fact a tugboat due to its 90-foot length and the fact that it had a steam boiler. If the name Kevin Dykstra sounds familiar to some of y'all, he was in the TV show The Curse of Confederate Gold with Rick and Marty Lagina. I wonder if they're ever going to bring that show back. Wonder what happened. I hate it when they start some show like that and it gets really interesting. Well, interesting to me, and they don't continue it. Kind of like Missing in Alaska with Ken Gerhardt. I loved that show. I watched it every week, and they just stopped making it. In 2018, Great Lakes Exploration Group, using satellite and aerial images, located a shipwreck and a debris field 3.8 miles from the site where the 19-foot long piece of wood had been excavated in 2013. In response to a request to excavate the wreck, the Michigan Department of Natural Resources dismissed the claim, saying, "Our archaeologist reviewed and recently published media images reveals the remains of a shipwreck that features typical 19th century Great Lakes shipbuilding materials and methodologies, and scatlings, that's pieces of lumber, used for cross section, that are entirely too large to be a French colonial vessel. The Kilson structure, with mast steps, uh, paired floors, and footlocks as ceiling timbers, all suggest a sailing craft, probably a schooner or a schooner barge, that was built and operated during the last half of the 1800s. Additionally, this particular shipwreck is well known, can be clearly seen on aerial imagery, internet sites, and has been visited by state authorities. Now, did they actually dive down and look at the wreck, or are they just basing their decision making on what somebody else has said? It must be noted that they are not 100% certain that they have found the wreckage of the Griffon, but the state isn't 100% certain that they haven't. They say it's a good match for the shipwreck found in 2018 in Lake Michigan. 3 years later, a bowsprit, that's the long spare that runs from the ship's bow, was found, which again suggests that it is a good match for the French bark. The bowsprit was carbon dated to within a year of the sinking. One of the most treacherous parts of the entire lake system is Lake Superior's Shipwreck Coast, an 80-mile stretch of shallow water between Munsing and Whitefish Point in Michigan. Hundreds of ships and lives were lost there over the years. Archaeologists hate it when other people find things without them. It's hard to justify your big paycheck while others are doing far better at finding things. 85% of all the things seen in museums are there because regular folks went out and found them and dug them up. Now, archaeologists, they get paid a lot of money for doing very little, it seems. Hope I didn't offend too many archaeologists. Actually, I doubt archaeologists listen to this show. If you do, let me know. As far as we know, the Griffon might have already been found, only to be misidentified as being some other vessel, or it may never be found. It's been 344 years since the ship went under. That's a long time for bits and pieces to be mixed up with other wrecks. The water at the bottom of the lake is cold and void of many of the marine creatures that would normally devour the wood. Who knows? They may find it tomorrow. They may have already found it and just called it by the wrong name. We just have to sit back and wait and see what the experts say. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. I know there weren't any monsters or ghosts or cryptids, but it was an interesting mystery. Ryan is very interested in the story, and since he wrote in and asked me to do the show, I did the show on the Griffon. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.